This is The Saucer Life, exploring the history and lore of flying saucers. I'm Aaron Gulyas. The Saucer Life is a podcast in which we explore concepts, events, or people from the world of flying saucers. No guests, no preconceptions, no snark, no belief, no debunking. Which is hard this week, because this is Encounter 105. They met the Space Brothers and Sisters. Since the 1950s, all the way up through the present, one of the most consistent, if not always the most numerous or popular aspects of the UFO, flying saucer, possibly extraterrestrial phenomenon has been that of individual humans coming into personal contact with beings that look, to varying degrees, like us, but claim to be from elsewhere. Since the 1950s, today we're going to look at these folks, known as the contactees, as a concept or a group, along with sort of the grand high progenitor of the contactees. And next week we'll take a look at another of my favorite contactees, one of my favorite characters from Flying Saucer Belief, one of my favorite stories ever, this week and next week. So it's a 1-2 punch of contactee goodness. Despite being around as long as flying saucers have been, pretty much, contactees and their beliefs are among the lesser-known aspects of UFO culture. They were, and mostly still are today, people who claim to have had either physical or psychic contact with extraterrestrial beings. There are some stereotypical characteristics of these encounters that make them different from abductions, but one thing that's become more common these days as we get into the 21st century is for elements of contactee-type encounters to really blur the lines with the more stereotypical abduction experiences. So we'll talk about that at a later time. But the lines aren't as clearly drawn as they were back in the 1950s. But back then, there's some things that made contactee experiences sort of what they were. The extraterrestrial beings, supposedly, were human in appearance and, in many cases, were identified specifically as humans from another planet. Often, not always, they hailed from one of the planets in Earth's solar system. This was especially true back before we knew as much as we do now about the atmosphere or makeup of Venus or Saturn or Neptune or Saturn, I said Saturn, or other planets. The contactees brought messages back to humanity on behalf of their alien friends, messages of things like universal brotherhood and warnings that Earth was in danger of destruction from violence and war, particularly nuclear conflict. Well, these characteristics are present in many contactee tales, and while contacteeism had its birth and peak in the 1950s, declined in the mid-60s, the story of contactees is a little more nuanced and has greater longevity than most know. So why haven't we heard about these folks much? Unless you're somebody who's heard about these folks a lot. There are a couple of good reasons. For one, the contactees' presence was largely literary, as opposed to having a massive visual presence in the media. Apart from festival appearances, or especially in the 1950s, guest spots on radio programs, you didn't see contactees show up in the news media as part of serious stories about flying saucer sightings and what they might be, like you did people like Major Donald Kehoe of NICAP, or Frank Edwards, or other writers and thinkers and personalities who became identified with, I hate to use this phrase, but flying saucer studies during that time. The shift in emphasis away from contact stories in the flying saucer mainstream towards a more, these are craft in the sky and we don't know who's in them, but we think they're aliens. That dominant UFO culture that emerged in the 1960s helped ensure that their stories have largely fallen below the radar, particularly in the United States. I mean, when hardcore saucer researchers like Donald Kehoe of NICAP say that contactees are making up their stories, and that's basically what he said. There's no debate here. They were making up their stories, he said. That's quite a blow to their credibility. And so news outlets that covered flying saucer stories tended to want to go to respected figures to get opinions. Now, contactees would show up in mainstream news stories in the 50s, but it was often as figures of ridicule rather than as serious sort of contemplation. In order to explore the story of the contactees, we really need to start with the original contactee, George Adamski. George Adamski was very much the prototypical flying saucer contactee. He claimed that he had his first encounter in 1952 and published the account in 1953. And his ideas and stories influenced these narratives for decades afterward. Adamski was born in Poland in 1891 and came to the U.S. when he was 2 years old. In the 1920s, he moved to California, founded a monastery, he called it a monastery, in Laguna Beach, called it the Royal Order of Tibet. Now, basically what this meant is that they talked about vaguely Eastern philosophy and were able to get a license to manufacture wine for religious purposes during Prohibition, and which is a nice little moneymaker. And during this time, he wrote a number of pamphlets talking about the dangers of war, greed, etc. After the first widely reported saucer sightings in 1947, it would be about 2 years before Adamski issued another public writing. This was a science fiction novel entitled Pioneers of Space, A Trip to the Moon, Mars, and Venus, and it was his first nationally published work. Though he never claimed that the novel held literal truth, in his foreword, he sort of strongly states that he saw this as more than escapist fantasy. Quote, "Man upon Earth is progressive and could be taken as a good measuring stick of the vast university in which he lives. We still see nothing but steady progress." And this is my favorite part of this. He encouraged readers to establish community roundtables and discussion groups using Pioneers of Space as a textbook, and invited readers to write to him with questions they might have about the book, about his ideas. It reads less than a science fiction novel than it does a weird travelogue. There's a rocket crew, they go to the moon, Mars, and Venus, and on each planet they question the natives about their lifestyles, cultures, and beliefs. All the civilizations were humanoid, they were all Caucasian, and they all worshipped a vague, nameless, supreme intelligence. All three of them, Moon, Mars, and Venus, said that they had once lived as Earth people, caring more for material goods and power than they did for love and cooperation. They explained that Earth's condition, its situation, was akin to that of a small child, not quite knowing how things worked and learning as it went along. But Earth might never achieve the higher level that their neighbors had because atomic blasts had thrown off the planet's balance. Space people had avoided this by overcoming materialism and greed. In Pioneers of Space, Adamski showed that these principles were being used by civilizations that were not too different from humanity was in the late 1940s. Same physiology, language. They'd overcome the problems with which Earth at the time was struggling, which doesn't really seem too surprising. Science fiction has often been a mirror for social commentary and political commentary. I think what's different about Adamski's science fiction as social commentary is that it's so sort of on the nose and blunt force. It's not a clever scalpel of satire and parody and commentary. It's just sort of a meat cleaver. This is what you think. This is what you should think because the Venusians are really smart and this is what they think. But it was all still fiction. Until the 1950s. By 1950-51, Adamski had stopped writing science fiction and embarked on his saucer life. He'd been lecturing to local groups, and he lived near Mount Palomar Observatory. He didn't work for the observatory, despite everything that he tried to imply sort of vaguely in his writings. He worked at a hamburger stand down the way from Mount Palomar, but he had a telescope, he was interested in astronomy, and he held discussion groups about the possible origins and intentions of the flying saucers. His expertise on the subject stemmed from a number of photographs he claimed to have taken with the help of several telescopes, and in 1953, he published his account of meeting a flying saucer pilot in the California desert. there's a British writer named Desmond Leslie who wrote a book called Flying Saucers Have Landed, and this was mostly a survey of mysterious craft throughout human history, Ezekiel's wheel in the Bible, things like that. Adamski's encounter made up about the last fifth of the book and expanded upon a story he'd been telling people in these discussion groups since the previous November. He describes meeting a man from Venus, and like the aliens in Pioneers of Space, the man looked, quote, like any other man, except for his ski suit-like clothing, long hair reaching to his shoulders. He communicated through telepathic, psychic communication, and Adamski said that his name was Orthon, although Adamski often is very explicit that he gives these names to these aliens. These aren't necessarily the names they use. They had a conversation, and Adamski closes it by asking why the saucers don't simply land on the White House lawn or other similar places. Orthon replies that his people were afraid of the response they would receive from humanity, because humanity was full of fear and was more inclined to fight rather than understand. Adamski closes his account with an appeal to believe in the Space Brothers for our own good.
A deep analysis of events of the past makes me firmly believe that these people from other planets are our friends. I am convinced that their desire and their object is to help us, and perhaps to protect us even from ourselves, as well as that they mean to ensure the safety and balance of the other planets in our system. But if we continue on the path of hostility between nations of Earth, and if we continue to show an attitude of indifference, ridicule, and even aggression toward our fellow men in space, I am firmly convinced that they could take powerful action against us, not with weapons of any kind, but by manipulation of the natural force of the universe which they understand and know how to use. I barely brushed against this force as it was being used in a subdued degree, yet I felt the effects of it for several weeks after the encounter. I have but one sincere purpose in narrating the foregoing experience. My most urgent message and plea to every person who reads it is, let us be friendly. Let us recognize and welcome the men from other worlds. They are here among us. Let us be wise enough to learn from those who can teach us much, who will be our friends if we but let them.
Reaction to Adamski's story was immediate. Flying Saucers Have Landed went through 11 printings in the first 2 years of publication. But despite this popularity, the nascent flying saucer research community was pretty split over Adamski's experience. He had many supporters among saucer researchers, but he also had some vociferous critics, and the most significant and outspoken was James Moseley, whose memoir we covered in our last episode. Moseley wrote a stunning and damaging expose on Adamski's encounter. It was published in January 1955, this issue of Nexus magazine. He started off by demonstrating that the saucer in Adamski's photographs could easily be replicated with any number of household goods. I think he cited a Chrysler hubcap, a coffee can, and ping pong balls. He went on to explain through interviews of Adamski's witnesses that it was pretty easy to see that none of them had actually witnessed the things that Adamski claimed they witnessed. They didn't see a craft. They didn't see a visitor. Adamski went off into the desert, came back where they were having a picnic or whatever, and told them these things. Adamski was undaunted by these claims. As he would always say, time will tell whether he was telling the truth or not. He published his next book in 1955, right about when the criticism really hit from Adamski's or from Moseley's expose of Adamski. The new book was called Inside the Spaceships, and it was basically his adventures aboard the saucers with the Venusians and Saturnians, and it's a lot like Pioneers of Space. It's clear that its inspiration was that earlier science fiction novel. It's a series of set pieces that basically outline alien beliefs and culture and practices. It's not a story. It's not a cohesive narrative. And he also introduced some space sisters into the mix.
As I stepped through the doorway into this luxurious lounge, my attention instantly was absorbed by two incredibly lovely young women who arose from one of the divans and came toward us as we entered. This was indeed a tremendous surprise, as, for some reason, I had never visualized women as space travelers. Their very presence and extraordinary beauty, the friendliness that was so apparent as they approached to greet us, together with the luxurious background in the out-of-this-world craft, were overwhelming.
Inside the spaceships was a logical extension of the Adamski belief system. He has conversations with a being called, well, he's a master. He's above the normal Venusians and Saturnians you meet, and all the conversations with the master are along the same lines. Humanity has to learn to obey the universal law to preserve peace around the world. And, as we hear in this excerpt, if we don't obey the universal law, then at least, maybe, we could live up to our own laws and our own ideals that we profess to hold.
There is nothing wrong with your Earth, nor with its people, except that in their lack of understanding, they are young children in the universal life of the one supreme being. You have been told that in our worlds we live the Creator's laws, while as yet on Earth you only talk of them. If you would live by the precepts of even what you know now, the peoples of Earth would not go out to slaughter one another. They would work within themselves, their own groups, their own nations, to achieve good and happiness in that section of your world wherein they were born, and therefore call home.
Perhaps, given the criticism of Adamski's accounts of witnesses who can corroborate a story and the exposés of his photographs, the book is not photograph heavy. There's 2 photographs of alleged spaceships, but there are drawings by Adamski of what the interiors of these ships looks like. And he lists no witnesses, no friends who could corroborate his story. Even more than flying saucers have landed, the account there, inside the spaceships requires the reader to believe Adamski's story on almost complete faith. Adamski's point, however, is not to convince the reader that he literally flew on a flying saucer. Rather, I believe his ideas about peace and cooperation take center stage here. The flying saucer is just sort of a stage for him to talk about philosophical ideas that he had held since before the flying saucers emerged. Adamski's third and final contactee book was published in 1960, and it's called Flying Saucers Farewell. However, the paperback was called Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery. This was often the case, that as different publishers picked up the rights to these books, they would change the titles to be what they thought was more engaging and more easily sellable. And Behind the Flying Saucer Mystery really does sound like it's more exciting than Flying Saucers Farewell. The book represented something of a departure from his formula of imparting wisdom and lessons on the cosmic law or universal law. Flying Saucers Farewell had 2 distinct parts, one original and one was just a reprint of his earlier pamphlet from the 30s, Satan, Man of the Hour. In the first part, Adamski responded to criticisms of his saucer tales and made up things like cosmic mathematics to explain why these things could fly. He attempted to prove that the saucer technology he described in his earlier books were science fact, not science fiction. And he mixed this up with some reiterations of messages from the great master from inside the spaceships, provides some lessons and teachings on universal law, cosmic law, further instructions that would help humanity move up that ladder of spiritual evolution. Adamski traveled the world with his, it might be a bit his shtick, his act, which it really was. He was a showman. He was a good speaker. He's an interesting speaker, called himself professor. Other people called him professor. He wasn't a professor of any kind. He would continue to maintain that the photographs he took were genuine. There are people today who believe the photographs are genuine or maintain that the photographs are genuine. The George Adamski Foundation is out there on the internet, and they are they're a core of true believers who basically maintain the intellectual property, Adamski's books, his photographs, and they guard that pretty tenaciously. When when I wanted to reproduce some Adamski saucer photographs in my my book Extraterrestrials and the American Zeitgeist, I of course had to get permission to use these photographs, and they wanted, I mean, more than anybody else, they wanted to know exactly what I was planning to say about Adamski, and honestly, I wasn't exposing Adamski, and there's no expose in my book because Jim Moseley did the expose back in 1955. But I sort of talked about him in the context of sort of fear and resistance to the emerging Cold War order. So I sort of spoke about him if not in glowing terms, but sort of as I did here. This is a guy with some philosophical ideas that predate his flying saucer deal, and it's an important strand of American history. But I did get permission to use the photos. But if you have a copy of book, $9.99 on Amazon, you will see that across all of the Adamski photos, in sort of Arial sans serif font is reproduced with permission of George Adamski Foundation and like their website or something. So they wanted to make sure. I think that's how they know if they see one of these pictures out there that this person had permission. At the end of Inside the Spaceships, some things get kind of strange. Or Flying Saucers Farewell. I meant not Inside the Spaceships. As he goes around the world, he talks about his saucer lectures in New Zealand and England and the Netherlands and Italy and India in the late 50s and early 60s. And he talks about how there were hecklers in the crowd and detractors and people who wanted to keep him from speaking. And he attributes this to the Silence Group, which is the name given by Donald Kehoe to the forces, in Kehoe's mind, the Air Force, that were trying to keep the truth of flying saucers hidden from the public. It's probably not coincidental that talk of an overtly sinister silence group, like Adamski discusses here, trying to shut him up, that this emerges after we see the emergence of the Men in Black stories that we spoke about several weeks ago in our encounter with Al Bender and Gray Barker and the Men in Black. There were people opposed to Adamski's teachings who saw him as a hoaxer, a fraud, a charlatan of some kind. And maybe he was. He would continue to write and lecture until his death in 1965. And it became more and more philosophical as he got older and older. And he really lost interest in doing anything to prove the reality of extraterrestrial visitation. He never abandoned that part of the story. He never denounced it. He just didn't waste his time trying to prove things to people who probably would never believe him, and focused more on his teachings of the cosmic law. He died in 1965, and one of the most persistent examples of his enduring influence among contactees began with his obituary, which was co-written by his earlier collaborator Desmond Leslie and his longtime associate Alice K. Wells, who drew some drawings of Orthon in the original book. Wells claims that Adamski was, quote, a member of the Interplanetary Council, and that while his earthly body had died, his eternal soul was still at work, assisting the Space Brothers. And Leslie confirmed that Adamski believed he had a soul which originated on another, more advanced planet. And he also tells, this is unverifiable, but resonated with Adamski's admirers. Leslie claims that Adamski had shown him a bizarre birthmark located around the navel. It was, quote, a huge solar disk with deeply cut rays extending out about 6 inches all around it from waist to groin. And Leslie believes this indicated Adamski was a child of the sun and, quote, doesn't believe by any means that we have seen the last of him. If he is reborn on another planet, he has promised to come back and contact us when possible. George Adamski was the first one to have a saucer afterlife. We'll conclude our little introduction to the contactees next time with our Season 1 finale, as we look at one of my favorite contactees ever, Truman Bethram, and the way that the saucer life can negatively impact the married life. In the meantime, thanks for listening. You can follow along with us at saucerlife.wordpress.com and on Twitter at saucerlife, or you can email us at thesaucerlife@gmail.com. We love your feedback, and if you could rate and review the show on iTunes, Google Play, wherever else, that would be great. Sharing and retweeting, we really appreciate that. Providing the link on various sites is great. I do want to give a shout out to Red Pill Junkie, who put a link to Encounter 104, our Read These Books segment, up on the Daily Grail. That was really appreciate that. Thanks. This time go out to Greg Bishop, whose article from a few years ago called My Bias Filter is Better Than Your Bias Filter, or Why I Like Contactees Better Than Abductees, introduced me, more than a few years ago, probably the early 21st century, 2001 or so, introduced me to how interesting the contactees could be. And I've linked to that article in the show notes on the website. The Saucer Life is a Chizo Media production. And until next time, keep watching the skies, because the skies are watching you. Orthon is watching you from Venus in his flying saucer.
It may be the